Sharon's teacher, Mrs. J, always began her lesson with a short test. Sharon didn't like tests, and knowing that these tests were never recorded by Mrs. J, Sharon always went late to Mrs. J's lesson. Each time Mrs. J questioned Sharon's lateness, she always had an excuse. "I'm sorry, Mrs. J, I had to use the toilet." "I'm sorry, Mrs. J, I was searching for my pen." "I'm sorry, Mrs. J, I hurt myself on my way here and I had to visit the clinic." Mrs. J got tired of Sharon's excuses and decided to use a twist to her lesson to see if Sharon would still be late to her lesson. Our next lesson will begin with a movie. Make sure you come early, Mrs. J told her students. The next day, which was the next lesson, Sharon was the first to get to Mrs. J's lesson. She loved movies and she didn't want to miss any part of it. As soon as Mrs. J saw Sharon, she smiled. "My trick actually worked to get her to come early today," Mrs. J said to herself. Hello friends, I hope you enjoyed that story because I did. I think sometimes we need to re-strategize to be able to achieve certain results. So let's have another story. Enjoy it. 2 minutes into Scott's Founders Day speech, he was hit by a bullet right in his chest. Immediately, the conference room went into disarray and everyone scrambled for safety. Hold on! How can a story begin with the action? I thought stories were meant to begin with an exposition where we learn about the characters, the setting, and events that leads to an uprising in the story. Well, that's right. Most stories begin with an exposition. However, some writers are like Mrs. J. They add a little twist to their work by beginning with the rising action. This is known as in medias res. In medias res is when a writer skips the conventional plot structure and begins a story from the middle of an action. Writers use in medias res to build tension in readers, grab the reader's attention, and create a mystery. In medias res keeps readers glued to the text and desiring to know what led to the rising action that began the text. Now let's look at the beginning of that text one more time. 2 minutes into Scott's Founders Day speech, he was hit by a bullet right in his chest. Immediately, the conference room went into disarray and everyone scrambled for safety. Now this beginning would make one inquire, who is Scott? Why was he shot? Who shot him? With these questions in the mind of the readers, the writer has created a mystery that hooks the reader to the story. Quite an interesting trick, right? I know. Why not add a little trick to your next story and use in medias res? I look forward to reading your story. Goodbye.